Hello everyone, welcome. This is a new lecture in your course Linux for Absolute Beginners by Aryonics. My name is Ahmed. This section is going to be, again, a little more theoretical than practical, but I promise you this is going to be the last section that is going to be theoretical. Starting from the next section, we're going to get our hands dirty and we're going to delve into Linux itself as an operating system, how to use it, and so on. But actually, this section is very important if you're going to use Linux because you got to understand what open source software is, what are the different licenses that make up the Linux kernel and the Linux programs, because more often than not, when you are going to work with Linux and read the documentation online and go to forums and other sources of information about Linux, you're going to hear the word open source program. So this section is going to be a short one, and it's going to be totally about which type of license does Linux use, the Linux kernel of course, and what is open source. So let's get started. Well, it all started with the copyright laws. Copyright laws were originally introduced to protect human creativity and guarantee that a person's right to claim ownership of their own product, physical or intellectual, is kept intact. Copyright laws were created because, for example, maybe I'm a painter or I'm a musician or a writer or in any profession that produces something that can be copied. That's where the name came from. It's copyright. It is preventing the illegal copying of some other's work. According to copyright laws, you cannot copy or clone anyone's work and use it without permission of him or her. But because those laws were created long before the first computer was invented, they cannot technically be applied on software programs. Because let's have an example here. If you have a software program that you need to use, in order for this software program to be installed, first of all, it has to be copied from the installation media. For example, the DVD that you have purchased, or if you have downloaded it from the internet, then okay, this is the first copy that has been made. It is that you have copied this software source from some website on the internet. You have downloaded it to your own local drive, so this is the first copy. Then when you install the binaries of this software on your computer, this is the second copy. It's made from a location on your hard drive to another location, say the program files, for example, if you're using Windows. And then when you get to run this program, the OS will make a copy of the binaries into the random access memory or the RAM, and this is essential for the program to work. So that's the third copy, for example, and possibly the OS will also make another copy of this binary file into the swap space. The swap space is just a portion of your hard drive that is used to assist the memory in its operation. We're going to see that when we discuss the different hardware components of the computer. You will learn that the swap space is often used in addition to the memory of your computer in order to provide more space for your programs to work. So that is another copy, maybe the third or the fourth. And of course, you might want to make a backup of this program so that when something wrong happens with your hard drive and this program and the data inside it gets lost, you will have a backup copy ready to be installed again or restored in case of disaster. So that way you have made several copies of the software, although the copyright laws prohibits you from making a single copy of anything that you have purchased. So because of that, those technically required copies were ignored. People just installed the software and the owners did not press any charges against them because they know that technically you cannot use the software without first copying to your hard drive and making those copies that we have just mentioned. So because of that, and in order to loosen up those copyright laws to make programs and software both technically and legally capable of being used, software licenses were introduced. Now, more often than not, when you have installed a software, you almost always see those lines of text that are printed on the screen that are displayed for you just before you click on the install or on next or whatever button you use to start the installation. This is sometimes called the end user license agreement or just license agreement or the license or any other term that refer to this type of thing. It is the software license. It is the terms and rules that the owner of this software program, the developer of this or the vendor of this software program has required you to read carefully and agree on each and every term of them before you can install and use their software or their programs. Those software licenses are meant originally to adjust the copyright laws so that using the software becomes both legally and technically feasible. When we're going to talk later in this section about open source software and proprietary software, we're going to see that software licenses that are used in open source software tends to loosen things up a little, while those used in proprietary software programs, or as it's sometimes called, closed source programs, need to even tighten those copyright laws more and more. Now, we've already talked about the Free Software Foundation in the previous section, and we said that it was the source or the origin of the GNU project. And as a refresher, the GNU project stands for GNU, not Unix. It is the project that is responsible for providing you with the programs that, together with the Linux kernel, make up the Linux-based OS. It is those programs that get shipped with your Linux installation, like the ones we saw in the previous section, like the ls program, for example, that is used to list the files in your current directory, or these were developed under the GNU project initiative. So the Free Software Foundation is the origin or the father of this project. It has been created under the belief that software must be free. And some confusion always arises when the term free is used, because free can refer to two things. It may refer to free as there is no cost for it, or sometimes it is referred to as free as in beer, and some other times free is meant to be in the context of liberal or of liberals, so as in, for example, free speech. Okay, so the FSF used the term free in the context of free speech, in the context of being liberal, in the context of lifting any restrictions, and not in the context of being free as free of charge, or free that means that you can use it without money. No, this was not the case. Free here means that you are free to modify, you are free to view the source code, you are free to redistribute the code of the program to other people with your own modifications. FSF believed that each and every software in the world has to be created and used that way. It also rejects imposing any restrictions on the intended use of software. So, for example, releasing a Linux kernel sometimes limits its legal uses to only a specific type of hardware. So let's say you have a Linux kernel that has been designed to be placed in an embedded system, like for example on a cell phone, and then you read the license that comes with the kernel, and you see that this kernel cannot be used except with this type of hardware. Let's say, for example, an Android phone. It cannot be used except with those vendors who create Android type cell phones. This is against the FSF standards, because the FSF rejects imposing any restrictions on the intended use of software. If you obtain the software, you are free to use it in whatever you need to, in whatever way you deem necessary. Okay? And because of the FSF standards, the GPL, or the General Public License, was introduced, and it is this license that the Linux kernel is released under, and actually most of Linux programs are released under this GPL license. Other programs are released under different licenses, as we're going to see in a moment in this section. And as a matter of fact, the Linux kernel is released under the version 2 of the GPL. GPL has 3 versions, version 1, 2, and 3. Version 1 is almost not used nowadays. The most commonly used versions are version 2 and version 3, and we're going to see the difference between both of them. But the Linux kernels are currently using version 2. The GPL fully complies with the FSF standards previously outlined, and because of that, one important aspect of this license is that it states that not only you are free to use the software in any intended use you want to, not only you can view and examine the source code of the software released under GPL, not only are you allowed to modify this source code and of course redistribute it again if you want to, but also if you happen to redistribute this software after modifying it, you have to release it under the GPL license. You are not allowed to change the license of your software even after you have made massive modifications to it. So that's why if you have a look at the Linux kernels, you'll see now that I guess the most recent kernel now has been released, which is kernel 4. This is the latest. So from the first kernel version to kernel 4, there have been various kernels with various patches and improvements and modifications and so on, but all of them have been released under the GPL license. All of them share the same license, version 2, and that is because that term in the GPL license, which states that if you attempt to redistribute the software released under GPL, you have to abide with the GPL license and release the new software also under the GPL license. Now let's have a look at the difference between version 3 and version 2 of GPL. Version 3 was recently introduced just some few years ago in order to fight some restrictions that would violate the FSF principles. So for example, because of the fast development of technology and because of the rise of new smart devices that are not computers but they act as computers, like for example the cell phones, smartphones, smart TVs, and so on, you have now the TiVo devices, and those use embedded Linux systems. They use Linux kernels in order to power up their devices, but the vendors of those devices requires the user to use a digitally signed version of Linux kernel. What does that mean? This means that if you, under GPL license of course, want to view and modify the source code of the kernel, you can of course do that. They have the source code shipped with the kernel, but if you make any modifications to the kernel, you can no longer use it to power up your TV device. That is because the kernel is digitally signed, and digitally signing means that any modification made to the kernel makes it void, and accordingly it cannot be used to power the device. So because of that, the GPL version 3 was introduced just to combat this sort of restriction and to keep the FSF principles effectively complied with. Now in the next lecture we're going to have a look at the open source initiative and the open source type of programs. So see you next.